series of videos is called The Truth About Nutrients, and in it we're going to go over how to mix and use nutrients, yes, but we're also going to go over how to think about them. And I know trying to calculate how many nutrients and how often you should feed with them can seem overwhelming at first, and that's because everybody has been explaining it to you all wrong until now. So keep watching and I'll show you everything you need to know about nutrients. And the truth is brutal, and brought to you by Humboldt Nutrients.
And this is episode 3. And the theme of this episode is veg versus flour, because I understand how easy it is to get confused about how much nutrient to use and when to use them. So in this episode, not only are we going to go over exactly how to mix Humboldt nutrients like the schedule says, all the way through veg and flour, I am also going to teach you how to think about nutrients too. That way, you'll understand why you're doing it, and then all you have to do is throw away your nutrients and go out and buy Humboldt nutrients, and we can get started.
But before we do that, there's some basic information you need to know about, and I don't care what nutrient brand you bought or are using, because even though Humboldt Nutrients is sponsoring The Truth About Nutrients, and even though we recommend Humboldt Nutrients in the store because they're easy to use and inexpensive to buy, it's still all the same shit. So keep watching, and by the end of the series, I'm going to prove it to you. So, let's start with an introduction. Hi, I'm the Grow Boss, and I have a hydro store where I get to meet lots of growers and listen to their stories, which is exactly how I wrote my book, The Grow Book and Equipment Guide, because for years now, I've been collecting and writing down all the questions my customers ask. And if at any time during this video, you want to find your closest hydro store, or where you can buy my book, or any of the Humboldt nutrient products you see in these videos, just click the opportunity button when it pops up, or go to everyhydrostore.com.
Okay, before we get into this episode, veg versus flour, let's do a quick review of the first 2 episodes. And if you remember, in episode 1, the theme was nutrient basics, because we went over all of the basics that you needed to know, like NPK and the numbers on the front of the bottle. And in episode 2, concentration and quality, we went over all the different factors that go into deciding how many nutrients you're going to use, based on what week and plant size and plant count and how long veg and how long flour is and how much light you have, right?
Which brings us to this episode, veg versus flour nutrients. And that's an important distinction, isn't it? How much of which is just right for veg, how much of which is just right for flour? And when exactly do you switch them? And when do we add supplements like Verde, Silica, Humboldt Honey, and all these others? And we know what Humboldt Nutrients thinks those numbers are, because we plotted their schedules back in episode 1. But now we also have to understand how to adjust those numbers based on your specific situation, right? Because clearly, according to our average Humboldt nutrient chart, they want more ppm when they get bigger, and they want more N in veg, and they want more pK in flour. But how do we adjust for that? If, for instance, we need to add one of those supplements to solve a problem. And we will get into that in episode 5. But for now, let's get started mixing all of Humboldt Nutrients' veg and flour products for every one of their nutrient schedules.
Okay, according to the average Humboldt nutrient chart we created back in episode 1, it tells us that a plant in week 1 wants 1 mil, or about 75 ppm. And then, when we look at the oneness schedule, for week 1 we can see it calls for 2 mils. So we already know it's a little bit higher. And then when we mix 2 mils in, the ppms are 140, which is close to what we were expecting, higher than average, but then this was only one of several nutrients that we use to build our baseline. And remember, the static baseline is an average. So let's keep mixing. Now, in week 2, our static average baseline chart calls for 2 mils or about 150 ppm. And then, when we look at what Master A and B wants, we can see the schedule calls for 2 mils of Part A and 2 mils of Part B. And together they come out to 165 ppm, which is really close to the average baseline we created and what we were expecting. Now, when we look at the week 3 average, week 3 calls for 3 mils or about 225 ppm. And the all-natural line wants us to use 5 mils from the veg bottle only. But if you remember when we did our static baseline, we used 5 mils from the veg and flower bottle, and our ppms came out to 425. But now in week 3, we're only using 5 mils from the grow bottle. And that comes out to 190 ppm, which is really close to the 225 ppm that we were expecting from the baseline. Now, before we go on to week 4 veg, I just want to take a moment to address something, because I'm really harsh when I say nutrients don't matter. Because when you guys come through my store, the brand of nutrients you're using is never what's killing your shit. It's always using too many of them. And we're literally talking about like 1 mil difference, right? So how important can nutrients be when we're talking about like 1 mil difference? That's why I want to take a moment and I want to say that even though we came up with a 425 ppm average for our static test when we used 5 mils of grow and 5 mils of bloom, now we're only using 5 mils of grow. So yes, the ratio has changed, but I'm trying to get you to focus on ppm, or the total salt you're feeding your plant, because nobody ever comes through my store and kills their shit with too little nutrients. It never works out like that. So I'm really trying to draw your attention to the amount of ppm per week, because that's going to matter in episodes 5 and 6, the more advanced episodes, when we start talking about the frequency of your watering. And now this is week 4 veg. And this is Humboldt Nutrient 3-part. And the schedule calls for 4 mils of each the week before transition. And if we add 4 mils of grow and 4 mils of micro and 4 mils of bloom to a gallon of water, we get 390 ppm, which is a little higher than the average feed chart predicts, but it's still right in that range based on 15 mils in week 3 flower. And I'd like to point something else out here before we move on to the first week of flower. And if you're at 12 mils the week before you go into flower, notice that Humboldt Nutrient has 12 mils when you transition into flower. Why? Because the plant is the same tomorrow as it is today. And even though we're at 12 mils for week 1 flower, if we look at week 2 flower, we are still at 12 mils. But the ratios have shifted, so the ppms will shift too, but not that much. And then, of course, in week 3 flower, the ratio changes again, and the mils increase. Now, for week 5, the transition week, or week 1 flower, oneness calls for 4 mils. And I know according to the average static schedule that we created, 5 mils of oneness is 450. Both hydro and media call for 4 mils in week 1. So, with 4 mils per gallon, oneness comes out to 340 ppm. And that's really close to the 375 we were expecting, and it's also right in line with 450 ppm from 5 mils, which was our average. And I know all these nutrients want all these supplements, And I know that Oneness wants Ginormous and Calyx Magnum and Deuce Deuce and Structural Integrity and Prozyme and Myco Madness and Humboldt Roots and White Widow and Honey ES. I know they want all those supplements too, and we're going to go over those in episode 5, additives and supplements. But for this video though, we're only mixing the base nutrients. All right? Now, let's mix the natural line for week 2 flower. And if you remember back when we mixed all natural for week 3 veg, we only used the grow nutrient because in the all natural 2-part line, you only use the grow during veg and you use them both during flower. So it's week 2 now, flower, or week 6 overall, and you can see whether we look at the hydro or the soil feed chart, we're going to use 5 mils of each. And 5 mils is what we used for our baseline. So we should expect about 425 ppm when we mix these together. And 515. And that doesn't surprise me because something as simple as the temperature of the water can change the ppm 10 or 15 ppm. That's why you don't need to worry about 5 or 10% of ppm if it's off from what the chart says or what you expect. But there is one more thing I'd like to point out when we look at the volume in the hydro versus soil charts during flower, and we'll see this more with Master A and B, but pay attention to the volume because there is a difference when it comes to hydro and soil. And the master line calls for 5 mils of each grow and bloom for week 3, and the ppms are 470, which is really close to the 450 we were expecting based on our static ppm chart. And I'd also like to take this time to comment on the transition from veg into flower, because this is week 3 flower or week 7 overall, which means we're just coming off the transition. So if we had a 2-week transition, week 3 flower could technically be week 1 flower. And I know what all the schedules say, but in my opinion, it's tough to account for the transition in an 8-week schedule. And with all the different options and ways to grow and strains, can you see why I tell you it would be impossible for a nutrient manufacturer to account for all those scenarios? Because if you did have a 2-week transition, then technically you'd have to have an 8-week flower that would be 10 weeks long, and you'd have to account for all of that, and that's tough to do in one printed nutrient schedule. Besides, if all the magic happens at the end, and after investing 12 weeks into this already, what's one more week for all that magic? Now, before we go on to week 4 flower, I would like to point out that there is a difference between the soil and hydro formulas when it comes to Master A and B and the natural formulas, and it's important to know what the difference is, especially in the later episodes when we get into the more advanced strategies. Now let's mix Humboldt Nutrients 3-part for week 4 flower, or week 8 overall. And if you remember back in episode 1, when we built our static baseline chart, we used 5 mils each of Humboldt Nutrient 3-part, and we came up with 650 ppm on average for the 3-part, but on average, the plants wanted 1 mils or 75 ppm per week. And when we used 15 mils of the 3-part, we got 650 ppm. But now, it's a week later, and the formula calls for 6 mils of each. So where we ended up with 1 mil per gallon on average times 75 times 8, we would expect 600 ppm. When we mixed the nutrients at 5 mils, we got 650. And now when we mix the nutrients at 6 mils each, we're at 775 ppm, which is a little more than we were looking for, but right on track with what we expected. And I know you're still looking forward to mixing all of the supplements and additives like Big Up and CMAG and CCal and Flavorful and Prozyme and all of these additives, and we'll get more into that later in episode 5, additives and supplements. But for now, let's mix nutrients. Okay, it's week 5 flower now, or week 9 overall. And let's use the oneness line again. And at week 5 flower, the oneness calls for 6 mils. And if you remember back when we did our static baseline, we used 5 mils of oneness and we got 450 ppm. And if oneness averages about 75 ppm per mil, we should expect about 500 ppm. And if we look at the average, if we're in week 5 flower or week 9 overall, and we're expecting 75 ppm per mil, then we should be expecting almost 800 ppm by the average. And yet, when we mix 6 mils of oneness, we're getting 520 ppm, which is less than we expected. And when we look at the static chart of all the nutrients we've mixed so far, you can see some are higher than average, some are lower than average. But that's why we created that static baseline, so we could tell each individual nutrient line and compare it back to that static baseline. Okay, so let's start week 10 with Humboldt Nutrients 3-part again. And when we made our static line originally, back in week 3 flower in episode 1, we used 5 mils of all 3 parts, and we came up with a ppm of 650. And now that we're in week 6 flower, or week 10 overall, the charts call for 7 mils of each. And it doesn't matter if we use hydro or soil, both charts call for 7 mils of each. So we should already have a couple of numbers in our head, right? We know 650 at 5 mils each, so 7 mils each, we should be heading toward 900 ppm. But if we look at our average chart, we got 1 mil per week at 75, so our average static line gives us an expectation of 750 ppm. And when we mix in 21 mils of Humboldt Nutrient 3-part, we get 840 ppm, and that's not bad. We were expecting a little more. Our average was a little less, so it's nothing to be afraid to water with. And I know I keep coming back to the fact that I'm going to tell you more about the difference between media and hydro later in the series, but for now I just want to point out, in the entire 3-part Humboldt Nutrient printed feed charts, the difference between soil and hydro comes down to hydro deuce and Humboldt roots and 4 weeks. Because if you look more carefully at these charts, 8 of the 12 weeks that you're going to be feeding, you are going to be feeding hydro and soil the same. And like I said, we'll get more into that in episode 6, Advanced Strategies. All right, let's finish up this feed chart with week 7 now. Okay, so we're now in week 7 flower. And week 7 and 8 flower is a little different. So instead of mixing nutrients, I thought I'd point something out to you. Because if you notice, in all of these schedules, in week 7 flower, the ppms suddenly drop. And in week 8, you're at 0 ppms. And this is called the flush. Because as your plant is finishing, you're going to decrease the ppm because she needs less as she's finishing, and you're going to flush the media or hydro out because you want to pull out the rest of those nutrients. But that brings up another interesting point, because suddenly in week 7 and 8, this has been the static chart line that we've been using to plot our nutrients, but again, suddenly in week 7 and 8, the ppms fall off. So this would more accurately represent that flush in the last 2 weeks. But that's not the only change, because if we look back at week 5, 6, 7, the schedules pretty much have us at the same ppm. So we can see that there's actually a leveling off as you finish flower before you drop the ppms during the flush. And this is super important, because it brings up a very real problem. And that is, how long was your transition? Because when we look at these schedules, we can see that in some of the schedules, the transitions ppms are the same, and in some they're different. And my observation is this: if you don't know how long the transition is, then how can you work out when the final ppm is, your max ppm at week 6? If you've got a 2-week transition plus 6 weeks of flowering, in week 8 you would be at your max ppm. Then 9 you'd be at less, and 10 you'd be your flush. And the thing about the flush is, if you have to go 2 more weeks, the nutrient schedules don't need to account for that. You would just continue on in weeks 9 and 10. But what happens if you have a 1-week transition? Or your transition happens in 3 or 4 or 5 days really fast? Or what happens if it's slower because you had problems for 2.5, 3 weeks? Then you would have to extend that first 4 and 5 weeks in flower, week 6 in flower, and you'd have to make those transitions. And now your flower would be 10 weeks long, and where you were at max ppm in week 6, you might be at max ppm at week 9 now, and then you might be flushing week 11 and 12. There's a lot of variance that goes into how to finish, and they just can't account for it in the schedules. I'd like to point out 2 more things before we go on. 1, if yield is really about nutrients, then how come at the end of the plant's life cycle, when the buds are the biggest and the most crystallized, how come we're at max light and minimum nutrients? You'd think if nutrients were the thing, we would need more at the end and less light. And I'd also like you to look at this schedule one more time, because only the natural soil feed chart, and I've been flashing it at you for a while to see if you'd notice, but the natural soil feed chart is the only one that has a 10-week flower time, which makes this chart 14 weeks long. And this is the only chart that Humboldt prints with a 10-week flower time. And this chart really gives you an idea of how you spread out the ppms over a longer flower time. So if you're looking for more information on how to spread out the ppms, look at the Humboldt Nutrient Natural Soil Chart. It's perfect to help get that idea into your head so you can visualize it.
And now that you know the difference between N, P, and K, what they do, and how to mix them, I'd like to review these schedules with you in a little more detail, especially when it comes to the volume of nutrients, or what we talked about back in episode 2, concentration and quality, which is how much to use. For instance, they suggest you add both Humboldt Nutrient Oneness and their 3-part at the same volume of mils, end of veg, and week 1 of flower. But then there's the master line that has you go from 6 mils total to 8 mils total, or an increase of 33%, while their natural line increases the mils by 80% from 5 to 9, which explains why the jump in the ppm trend line at the transition, right? And let's talk about the transition time and why I suggest you do not increase the ppm or the light for the first 2 weeks of flower. Because as far as I can tell, if you veg on a Monday and switch to flower on a Tuesday, then technically your plants are the same size. So why would you give them more of anything, whether that be light or nutrients? And that's especially true if you trimmed your plants back, or you thin them by weaving them into a trellis, right? Because if you decrease the size of the plant, or you increase the penetration of the light by decreasing the canopy thickness when you weaved it into a trellis, then technically you have both less plant and less canopy. So how can you possibly justify feeding a smaller plant more light or nutrients? That's why so many growers have problems when they switch into flower, because you change too many things at once and you change them in the direction of too much, instead of just chilling and waiting a few weeks before adjusting the total light or total nutrients. Think about that. If you veg for a scrog, then technically when you moved your plants into flower, You'd have to trim them back and thin them out when you weave them into a trellis. And if you do that, you would be crazy to increase the light or the nutrients or both, all while shrinking the canopy. Think about that. You decrease plant size and thinned her out, and you want to increase the light and the nutrients when you go into flower? Why? Because they don't really account for that on the bottle, do they? And that's why I always laugh when customers tell me their nutrient schedule, because that's not how nutrients work. Remember, this entire series is based on a 12-week media garden with 1,000-watt light, with 8 to 12 plants vegged in 1-gallon smart pots for 4 weeks before being transplanted into 5-gallon smart pots and weaved into a scrog with an 8-week flower time. And if you have anything different, you'll have to adjust for it.
And I know back in episode 1, Nutrient Basics, I promised to talk more about super soil. But I waited until now because I wanted you to understand the relationship between ppm and plant size, and the difference between veg and flower nutrients, and how many mils and how much ppm that is relative to the size of the plant and the week that they're in. And what I think we're really talking about when it comes to super soils is this. If all nutrients are pretty much the same, then all super soils must be pretty much the same, right? Like, there's only so many microbes you can put into a super soil. So if you've got one super soil with all the nutrients and all the microbes, how much difference can another super soil be? And so what I would like to suggest that the conversation about super soils shifts towards is more about how hot the mix is. And here's what I mean. Let's take a look back at the static chart we created about the nutrients. And what we know is a plant in week 1 wants 75 ppm worth of nutrients and 1 mil. And in week 2 she wants 2 mils and 150 ppm. And in week 3 she wants 3 mils and 225 ppm. That also means she wants as many nutrients in week 3 as she did in both weeks 1 and 2 combined. But that also means if you were to transplant a little cutting into a super soil that was hot enough for week 4 or more, that would mean you transplanted a plant that wants just 75 ppm into like 700-800 ppm soil, which is a lot of ppm and not exactly the move I would have made. But it is exactly why I say too many nutrients is the #1 problem. And if we are talking about super soil that's biologically activated, well, we could have activated any media just by making a tea from liquid underground. But more importantly, what I consider to be a super soil's biggest benefit is their combination of nutrients and biologics. And what I think is a perfect use for a super soil is like a media-based grow, where you top dress your soil or your cocoa with a handful of super soil and then water through it for your nutrients and biologics. Okay, now that you get the basics of nutrients and how to mix all the different nutrients for all the different weeks, in episode 4, we are going to get more into the difference between veg and hydronutrients and the difference between mixing the nutrients for each, because I assure you, it's not what you think. But for now, let's finish up this episode.
Okay, thanks for watching. I'm the Grow Boss, and if you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and if you have any questions between now and then, you can always schedule a consult with me by clicking here. Trust me, I know how much you've spent and how much time you have invested in this, and I promise, I can fix your garden in about an hour. So call me before you quit.